This is the GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 196 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with returning guest Phil Normandy about a small town arboretum. The plant profile is on creeping raspberry, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with a last word on Stumpy's Farewell from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Phil Normandy, retired plant collections manager of Brookside Gardens, and we're going to be talking all about a small town that made itself into an arboretum. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, Kathy. It's fun to be back.
We had Phil previously on episode 75, Versatile Virburnums, and we learned about your career trajectory all the way from, I think, the Carolinas to Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland, and your long tenure there, and your love and passion for viburnums amongst many other plants, right, Phil?
Yes.
And maybe a little bit of an update I'll ask you for. So, anything new happening in your personal home garden or any other plants that you're excited about that are coming on the scene?
Well, in my home garden, I discovered that the back garden went to shade and the front garden, when the county took down the street tree, became sun. So I've been having fun digging up the horrible clay and
Mm,
putting in lots and lots of amsonias and baptisias and companion plants. And that's brand new for me. And it's been quite fun because it goes from nothing in January into this very lush looking perennial border now. So that's been a lot of fun.
hmm. And I'm sure you are keeping busy during your retirement.
It certainly seems to be. It is. I'm volunteering 1 day a week doing plant records at Brookside Gardens, and I am still, as you know, because of the topic of today, I am still the town arborist for the town of Garrett Park here in Montgomery County.
Hmm. So we should let listeners know who might not be familiar with Brookside Gardens that it is situated in Wheaton, Maryland. That is north of Washington, D.C., in the mid Atlantic United States. Tell us a little bit about the growing conditions for Brookside Gardens and the general area in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Well, we are in the Piedmont region, which is between the coastal plain and the mountains, an East Coast sort of phenomenon, at about what is it, 300 feet in elevation. Clay soils. It's now zone 7A, used to be 6B. So we're able to grow. I'm going to say we, it's a generic we. We're able to grow more things these days than we could 30 years ago. Um, uh,
Hmm.
Usually 40 some inches of rain, periods of drought in the summer. The last 5 winters have been quite mild, even milder than 7A. And so a lot of things are popping back that typically you would have found, say, in the past in the Central Carolinas.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm about 10 miles south of that. So all the same growing conditions that you describe. And maybe I think this spring, I want to say, I don't want to jinx anything, knock on wood, Phil, but it's been one of the best springs that I can recall for gardening.
Well, it's been cool and rainy, so we're having more English conditions or
Hmm.
Pacific Northwest. And I think maybe that has affected a lot of things blooming and not burning out.
Yeah, I think peonies, roses, everything is looking fabulous. And listeners, please excuse that little cat cry. That was my little cat Fancy trying to get my attention because she doesn't believe that a podcast doesn't include her. So let's turn to the topic of this podcast, Phil. And so you work with Garrett Park, Maryland. Let's describe that town and maybe a little bit about the governance and how that is run versus other municipalities and unincorporated areas in the Washington, D.C. area?
Well, Garrett Park is literally a town. It's a very small town. It has a mayor and council. It was begun in 1898 when the railroad line was extended out going towards West Virginia. And the idea was it would be a green oasis where people could have summer places to escape the city heat, because remember, we didn't have air conditioning, but we had shade, at least out in the country, and it was way out in the country. Um, it's basically where it's located. It's in Lower Montgomery County. It is just west of Rock Creek Park at Beach Drive, and it is directly west of Rock Creek, and it runs for 4 blocks going west along Strathmore Avenue, which is Maryland 547, towards Rockville Pike. But it only goes for 4 blocks, and it's on both sides of 547. So it's a pretty small, landlocked community, about 900 households. I don't remember what the acreage is, but it's obviously with something like that, it isn't very large.
It's pretty tucked in there.
It's tucked in there, and it's got a lot of old houses from the beginning, but also a lot of infill from the 50s as the large lots were subdivided. So the housing types are all quite variable as well. And what it's known for, even in the day, and it's fortunately continued to today, is its tree cover. A survey that the town had done to develop a comprehensive plan for its public trees found that Garrett Park has an 87% canopy cover, whereas the average for all of Montgomery County is 37%. So if you were to be able to look at this on a map, which you probably can, it'd be this great big green spot in the middle of scattered green.
I recall being in Garrett Park for a couple garden tours and mostly being impressed by some of those big old Victorians and some of their surrounding gardens that still have some of their um, period type gardens. And then, of course, as you mentioned, some of the newer houses. But also, it's on the commuter MARC train line that goes up to Brunswick and then into West Virginia from DC. So many people will know it as that little stop on the way.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask a little bit more about Garrett Park as far as how they contacted and hired you. Was that through the town council decided that they needed um, a tree consulting, or were they just looking to beautify, or was it a health issue with the trees that brought that relationship together?
Well, it was all of those things. It was partly founded on relationships, and I'll get to that. But in 1978, there was a very active resident in town, a woman named Barbara Shidler. And Barbara is passionate about trees. And she looked around this town and it saw that its street trees were leaving. They were aging out, basically. And it was also right after Dutch elm disease had come in. And so there was several blocks that were American elms that had recently had to come down. And so she saw that this town was losing its old town tree-lined street character and decided just single-handedly to go to the town council and advocate for money and support to get tree work done and to have trees planted. That was her first impulse. And then she decided, well, why does it have to be just elms and maples? Why can't it be a collection of trees along the streets and in the parks of the town? So she was very tied into the idea of arboreta. She was probably, I know she was a member of the Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, probably had been to Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania many times, and of course was familiar with Brookside Gardens. And so she basically single-handedly convinced and pushed and shoved and cajoled and did all sorts of personal volunteer unpaid work to get this off the ground. And so in approximately 1979, the council made a resolution to declare itself an arboretum, which is mostly a nickname or a name. It doesn't have any legal standing. But putting it into the record like that meant that it said that the town had a commitment to trees. Barbara then went off and started collecting odd trees every place she could. She would go to the Arboretum sales in Philadelphia and here in DC and just all over the place. And she would grow these, she'd get them small and she'd grow these things in her backyard. And then she would work with the town maintenance person and they would get these things planted. And that's how it all got started. Along about 1996, she realized that there was a need to have some paid professional help because she couldn't do it all by herself. And I think she also felt that there was a need not only for planting and acquisition, but for someone to manage the tree care of the mature trees.
Mm-hmm.
It was there. Now, there was another woman in town, also named Barbara, who was working with local tree companies to get pruning and so forth done. But the idea was to pull all this together. So she leaned on the current director of Brookside Gardens in those days, a woman named Els Benjamin, who was a resident of Garrett Park, and said, "Do you think your young horticulturist, who seems to know a few things about trees, would be interested in consulting with us?" And so that's how the relationship was born.
Barbara sounds like an amazing person, and then the second Barbara as well. Are they both still involved? Have they moved or passed on?
Well, the second Barbara has passed on. The
Mm,
first Barbara is living in an adult community down at the DC line, and we give her updates regularly, but she's not able to get out very much. I think she's just turned 96.
wow. Well, I hope she gets to regularly see photos or catch up on that as well.
She does.
One thought I had when you were talking about the ample tree coverage for Garrett Park was the quality of life is obviously improved with that amount of tree coverage, but also probably the property values. So, are there a lot of new homeowners coming into Garrett Park or a lot of turnover, or do most people buy in and stay for life?
It's not as much turnover as you would imagine, given
Mm-hmm.
that the change of generations nationally. People do tend to buy in there and stay, although eventually they age out and new people come in. And so far, there's not been a lot of teardowns, which is very unusual for some of the more pricey areas or good school districts in lower Montgomery County, where whole neighborhoods are being turned around to larger houses with the attendant loss of tree cover.
Mm-hmm.
Here, there's not been a lot of it. I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be an enormous challenge because it's extremely difficult to control builders. It does not
Hmm.
matter what you slap on them, they're managed to still pretty much kill most of the trees on the lot, even if they, quote, protect them. So that's something that I'm very afraid of. You do, if to remove a town tree, you do have to have permission. You can't just go in and do it. And of course, if you're a builder, you have to have a building permit, both from the town and from Montgomery County, that involves a tree protection plan. That doesn't really save anything, but it's a start.
Hmm. And so if it's on private property, they just have to have that protection plan. But again, as you say, there's no teeth to it.
No, that's not quite accurate. It is true that, like most places, Garrett Park only controls the trees that are on its right of way or in its public lands.
Ah, okay.
They have no jurisdiction over private trees, although we try to work with residents. We certainly answer their questions. I just did this Sunday with a new resident who was set to cut down 800-year-old trees because he didn't know any better. And we managed to have a very congenial meeting and informative on both sides. And he's going to do some thinning, but I think it's going to be a very good compromise.
And to clarify, that is 8 100-year-old trees, not one 800-year-old tree.
Do you think this is California?
Yeah, we've lost a lot of our tree elders that would have been of that age.
Hmm.
So let's talk about some of the tree mix that Garrett Park and most of the Mid Atlantic would have. So obviously, you touched on the elms and some of the prior trees that we've lost.
Wait, do you want to talk about what's in the forest or what would be in the forest, or do you want to talk about what's planted on the streets?
Planted on the streets. I think what a home owner or a home gardener might have or inherit when they purchase a home or move into a home, what they're liable to encounter.
Well, Garrett Park was essentially nothing but a giant tulip tree forest.
Mm.
when it was founded. I don't know how old the trees were. They might have been a young tulip tree forest. And in this part of the world, that is the primary succession tree. That is one of the main trees that comes up after fields are abandoned. In the south, it would be pine trees, but here it seems to be tulip trees. And so there is an inordinate amount of very old tulip trees in Garrett Park, which, to be quite frank, is nothing but one great challenge trying to live with tulip trees because they are so brittle. And of course, they're scary. They don't necessarily have to be scary, but when you have people who were not brought up around trees who have had bad experiences, they take a look at them and they quiver. So tulip trees have heavy foliage and they have very weak wood, and so they are prone to losing limbs in storms. And
Hmm.
so it's a huge proportion of the existing large trees in town are tulip trees.
And I think one tree in particular that I was thinking about are southern red oaks are on the decline in the area. And I had heard another arborist say a week or so ago that they are no longer recommending planting red oaks in our area because of that.
Red oaks or just southern red oak?
I think either.
Hmm. Well, you don't generally plant southern red oak because they typically have a terrible reputation in the nursery.
Mm,
The oaks that are typically planted in general in landscapes are ones that do well in nursery culture, which has to do with the type of root system they have and whether or not they regrow cut roots quickly or have a little or very little taproot. The species of oaks that do the best in nursery practice are the ones that have fibrous roots that regenerate quickly. And northern red oak is one of those trees, as is pin oak, but southern red oak is not a tree that is typically grown in field conditions and nurseries because they don't transplant well. However, they're very prominent or prevalent in this area as native trees.
And what other, I guess we'll call them old growth, tall growth trees, and then we'll get to the understory ones. Do we favor in this area or do we encounter normally in most backyards?
Well, if you have an old forest, in which there are pieces of Garrett Park that have remnants of old forest, you would what's called the climax forest, which is the forest of stasis if it was left alone for about 300 years, is something called the oak hickory forest. And so you would find mature oaks and mature hickories dominating the canopy in such forest. And there are little bits and pieces of that, not original forest, but old forest in Garrett Park. So there are large red oaks and large white oaks in certain areas of the town. And many of these are at the 125 to 150-year-old mark.
And I think when a lot of people encounter, as you say, a little bit of trepidation about some of these large old trees that might be on their landscape, they're looking to take them out because they want to have more safety, I guess, is what they're thinking, that these trees are going to be failing soon because of their age. Or what other concerns are you hearing?
There's a general fear of trees.
Mm,
And I don't mean to say every single adult person who lives in the suburb has this, but it is a very large fear. And all they need to see is some news flash of a tree that went over somebody's house and dropped a limb through the roof. And immediately after large storms, you find wholesale tree removal because people are afraid. And I'm not saying that there isn't a risk, because when you live with trees, there's always a risk because, let's face it, trees are made out of wood and they can fail. The safeguard is that you have your trees checked regularly for health, for signs of disease. You have them pruned if you are concerned about their size, particularly near houses. You never top a tree, and there are unscrupulous tree companies that will come in and sell you a tree topping job where they
mm,
turn trees into tinker toys, and that actually ends up causing the tree to be less safe because the branches that grow from these cuts are very poorly attached. So this is a procedure that is very bad industry practice, but I guess it's a moneymaker, and it sells peace of mind, which, I can't say that if you live under a tree, you won't ever experience a fallen limb, no matter how good you are. The younger the tree, obviously, the stronger the wood, the healthier it is in general. Most of what is failing is oftentimes just healthy limbs that break in storms. It's not always the case that undisturbed trees that have never had, a lot of building or fill dirt or compaction or root cutting or trenching, those rarely ever blow over. When you see these pictures in upper northwest of all the trees that went down, they're often trees that are street trees, sidewalk trees whose roots have been impacted by years of foot traffic, root cutting, de-icing salts, and all those other urban ills. One of the nice things in Garrett Park is that the soils are relatively undisturbed. De-icing salt is rarely used in town, so we don't have that problem. And there's not a lot of hardscape infrastructure, heat island type of things to stress the trees.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of old trees in town, and sometimes we have surprises where we find that the trees have flaws in them up in the crown that we never noticed, and after a windstorm we will have things split out that we could not predict because the structure looked good and the crown looked healthy and there was no sign of disease. So we just monitor as well as we can, and if a tree starts to look suspicious, then it has to go.
And it's, I think, such a hard science because everything is living and growing, right, and changing.
Yes.
Let's turn to some of those smaller tree choices. And Phil, you and I had a discussion prior to this recording about some of our passions amongst the small trees. And I'm looking out my window now at my Stewartia, which is just about to be in bloom. So maybe we'll start off with Stewartia and some other similar choices that might be that understory tree layer under these larger growth trees.
Well, we have lots of smaller trees that have been planted, some of which are odd and strange because it's, again, an arboretum,
Hmm.
and we have access to buying things or procuring things at arboretum plant sales. We have a few Stewartias in town. It's a good understory tree for the town because the soils are undisturbed, they're cool, and there's a lot of high shade. Remember, high shade is shade that's high as opposed to shade that's heavy, not dense shade, in other words. And so it's a good choice for that. It's not really a great plant for full sun. It's a little finicky, so you have to have good soil. It doesn't have to be rich. It just has to have a good texture that drains well, and it likes its feet cool. And I believe we have 3 or 4 in town, none of which are terribly old, but they're not. I mean, they're like 20 years or thereabouts. One tree we don't have in town, which we've always wanted to have, but repeatedly have failed with it, is a Franklinia,
Mm-hmm.
which is a beautiful sort of candelabra shaped flowering tree that likes a surprising amount of sun, and maybe that's our issue. And we will still try to plant that, but we haven't had a great deal of luck with that.
Yeah, that's one that I've always had my eye on, and then I always hear stories of failure or stories where of people who've tried it who haven't done their best. So I just tend to enjoy them at the local public gardens where they're at.
They actually want more sun than you would believe. You think of them as this rhododendron like thing, which it is not, but they really want no heat, no drought, and no flood. So if you can give them cool, friable garden soil with
Hmm.
at least a half a day of sun, they will do their best that way.
And I think a lot of the understory trees like redbuds, etc., they prefer morning sun, afternoon shade, but we can't cite all our trees in that because that's a
No,
limited amount of space in most of our landscapes.
it's true. And some things will surprise you. I mean, you can certainly see redbuds growing in full sun everywhere, and they don't seem to mind.
Hmm.
I think in the woods you find them in openings or at the edges where they can lean their heads out into sun. And
Mm.
that's where they're the most full, as opposed to the sort of ghostly ones you see in the deep forest.
That's also where I tend to see dogwoods, I think, a lot,
Hmm.
and where they're more flowering or floriferous is where they get a little bit of more sun, but, and again, not as spindly as they would
Right.
be under a heavy shade situation.
It's true. So let's see, what else do we have we have a few Kusa dogwoods.
Mm.
It's those are for the open spaces, of which there aren't very many, because Kusa is just not a tree for shade. It will live, but it won't do much. It won't really flower. It likes bright light, at least a half a day of sun, and it doesn't like a lot of things over its head. This, of course, as you know, is an amazing bloom year for Kusa dogwoods. And if that's a confusion to our listeners, the Kusa dogwoods are the ones that are blooming now, right around Memorial Day. and they bloom with their leaves on them. They are not the same as our native dogwood that blooms with the bulbs and the azaleas
Hmm.
4 weeks or so ago that bloom without the leaves.
And we did recently have an episode all about dogwoods, and I'll link to that in the show notes for this recording. And I did want to note some of our favorite flowering understory trees might also have variegated leaves like the Kusa dogwood. And I know that you, Phil, are a particular connoisseur of variegation.
It's true, and I've learned a few things late in life, and it's kind of nobody taught me this. It's kind of strange. Some variegated plants like a little bit of shade so they don't scorch because they lack certain protective layers in their leaves.
Hmm.
Whereas some variegated plants will die in shade because they don't have enough chlorophyll to keep them going. I learned this the hard way. An example of this would be the wonderful variegated aralias, which are pricey and rare, and I've seen people try to plant them as understory trees so they get a little bit of sun protection, and they just die. They really want to be in full sun. I don't know why one type of plant is like this and one is not, but it may have to do with various layers of their leaves. There are variegated Kusa dogwoods, and they really would prefer strong light. Doesn't necessarily have to be full sun, because, like I said, Kusas really don't want to be in darkness. And there are a number of variegated cultivars out there now. The one of the most common would be wolf eyes. That's somewhat easy to find.
Wolf Eyes is one Kusa dogwood that I have, and it is blooming for the first time since it was planted several years ago. I think 7 years ago. And I
Mm.
think you were saying, Phil, that they're every other year bloom.
Well, it seems to be
Hmm.
not. It's not officially that, but every other year seems to be the case. And of course, if you have a variegated Kusa dogwood, it's partly its flowers when you get them, and they're not as floriferous, in my opinion, as the straight green ones.
Mm.
But the flowers can get lost in all that variegation. So the good thing about the variegated ones, of course, is you have that color burst of gold or white all growing season. Doesn't matter whether they bloom or not.
That's such a good point that you made about some variegated ones need more sun for the chlorophyll because they obviously probably have what 50% less chlorophyll in those leaves
Yeah.
depending on how much cream or white edging or centers that they have. But yeah, I tend to plant them and baby them and put them in part shade to shade just because you think they're going to be scorched. So that's great to know, and maybe we need to do a little more experimentation with those.
Yeah, I couldn't give you a hard and fast rule, honestly. I'm still learning. It's just strange. I guess it has to do with the substance of the leaf. And
Hmm.
certain variegated hostas are just fine in sun, and others have to be in the shade or they just toast.
Hmm. Yeah. So, like most gardening, it's all an experiment and
Hmm.
scientific trial and error, and just move it around till it's happy.
Can I talk about some of the other understory trees we have?
Sure.
There are two very large dove trees in Garrett Park. And dove trees are a rather rare tree and kind of finicky to get started. And they can get to be 40 feet if they're happy. And what's wonderful about them is in mid-May or late April, actually, this year, they start to bloom as the leaves come out, and they have these heads of flowers that are not particularly showy. They look a bit like dandelions, but then they're surrounded by these two large, gigantic white bracts. And people call them dove trees because, in their minds, it looks like white doves are perched in the branches of these trees.
Hmm.
They're also called handkerchief tree for the same obvious reason. There's a very large one in Garrett Park on the street, and I have some pictures of it this year. And you look up into these trees, and they're just astonishing to see all this sort of these flowers hanging out inside of the canopy
Hmm.
with the green leaves coming out.
Yeah, it's such a stunning tree, and I think the first time people see it, they're like, "What is that?" Because the flowers are so differently shaped. One giant petal almost,
Yeah,
but draping down. So interesting.
and they're hard to get established.
Yeah.
You can buy them, but they're hard to get established, and I think that's related to the fact that they're in the same family as black gum, which is also a somewhat hard tree to transplant.
Hmm.
And I think the secret to them is they definitely want a little bit of sun protection. and they definitely want a cooler soil. I took one that was failing from a local gardener. It was about a 5 or 6 foot tall tree, and it was getting shorter every year. And despite the fact that she had really good soil, she had put it in a wide open situation, and she was done with it. She was going to throw it out. I said, well, let me take it and plant it at our other local, the county's other local public garden, Macrillis Gardens in Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
And you should see that thing. 20 years later, it is 40 feet tall, and it's probably 8 or 9 inches in diameter, just because it got put in this rather open woodland slope in clay. It was very happy.
I've been lucky enough to get over to Macrillis and actually take photos of that same tree you're talking about
Ah,
while it's in bloom. And yeah, that's really the sweet spot of late April, early May. And those who are listening to this in the Washington, D.C. region, Macrillis is a public garden, a small one. Used to be a private home in Bethesda. It's a little tucked in there, but it is accessible.
hmm
And I was going to say about Dove Tree as well that I think it's one that is definitely a conversation piece, but maybe for the rest of the season, you might not even notice it when it's not in bloom.
It's true. It's probably something that belongs in a specialty setting, unless you're
Hmm.
just an obsessed gardener and you like the unusual and the odd and the challenge of growing it. So because we're in shade, we don't have a lot of, say, crepe myrtles. That's not something you would see there. And we don't actually plant American dogwoods very much because there are a lot of them along the streets already
Hmm.
that were there. We have a couple of the Rutgers hybrid dogwoods that are crosses between Coosa and Florida, and those are blooming now too. Those require a lot of sun, and so our spaces in Garrett Park for that are limited. But what we have been doing a lot of planting lately, and we're not restricted to natives, but there's a very strong interest in adding more natives to the collection because it was primarily the founder, shall we say, thought of the arboretum aspect as bringing in things that you wouldn't find in the woods or natively, and because
Hmm.
so they would be more rare and special and exotic. And so the balance was a little bit off in that direction. So in the last couple planting cycles, we've been adding a lot of fringe trees and redbud cultivars, of which there are quite a few nowadays. Fortunately, there's a lot of work developing new redbuds, serviceberries, things like that.
Hmm.
Because there's shade, as you heard, and there's power lines, of course. And so we have a lot of planting spots for understory trees in town and not so many for the large trees.
That could also include what would be called a shrub, maybe trained into a tree.
Oh, at the serviceberry?
Yeah, I'm thinking serviceberry and some of the other large shrubs, maybe not a rhododendron trained into a tree form, but others that could go either way, say like witch hazel.
Well, we have focused mostly on things that are considered trees because the Arboretum Committee is not the landscape committee.
Hmm,
And some of the members on the Arboretum Committee feel fairly strong that we should not be doing, quote, beautification. So I guess the thing we would go the closest to would be we put in a lot of American hollies this year for screening.
hmm,
And because those become tree-like, committee did not feel like that was a quote beautification. I have planted witch hazels in the past. I'd like to plant some in the future, but it would have to be in just the right location.
interesting. So, for those who want to go walk around Garrett Park and see some of the plantings, I mean, it's open, it's public streets.
It's town.
It's a town, but do you lead walks or are there guided tours?
Well, I do lead a walk twice a year. There's one coming up this Sunday afternoon. It's typically attended by town residents. And we just take a stroll through town and we look at what's going on at the moment. So, right now, for example, there's one entire block of Chinese tree lilacs that are in full bloom. This is, by the way, an amazing year for tree lilacs. You probably noticed.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a particular cultivar whose flowers have a distinctly butter yellow color and they're very fragrant, unlike most tree lilacs. So we'll be looking at those. So that walk is usually the last Sunday in May, and then on a Sunday afternoon. And then in October, usually, or November, usually the day after daylight saving time changes, we have a fall walk, and that we can celebrate the legacy of sugar maples, which form the backbone of the main street planting in town. It's an historic, scenic aspect, I guess you would say.
Hmm.
Originally, a lot more of the town was planted to sugar maples, but we've reduced it to just one or two iconic streets so we didn't have a monoculture.
That's reminding me of some of the other neighborhoods in our region that have allays or street plantings of ornamental cherry trees and similar.
True. And so there's places in town, because of competing vegetation, where we are not able to plant allays, so to speak. So that's kind of cool, because being an arboretum, you can do a one-off. You have a niche, you have room for a tree, but you don't have room for a block of trees. So this last planting season, I recently put in a pond cypress. There was a sunny spot, and it's the sort of thing that's odd enough that people might stop and go, well, you don't see that every day. And yet it's a plant that's native to the southeastern US and grows perfectly well on dry land.
So for those outside the area or not able to get over to Garrett Park, I know there's an online map of the Arboretum. And so I was going to have you walk me as well as our listeners through how to access it because it's not the easiest web link to find. So we go to garrettparkmd.gov, G-O-V. So Garrett is Garrett, two R's, two T's, park, just like a park,
hmm
MD, just like doctor, and for Maryland, obviously, .gov. And then from that front page, where do we go, Phil?
Well, I don't even do that because I'm lazy. I just Google Garrett Park and the website comes up and you click
Uh-huh.
on it. When that happens, it'll open up to a home page, and right under the big picture, there's a couple of buttons for frequent things you might want to find, like council meetings or other things that are going on. But there is a big button right there that says Town Trees. It looks like it's saying Town Trees and Row Maps.
Yep.
Row is actually right of way.
Okay. And row maps, I've clicked on that.
You click on that,
Hmm.
and it's going to give you a second page. There's either a blue link in the second paragraph, or there's actually a green box and it says map of town owned trees. You click on that. I mean,
Yep.
it's really straightforward. And then this beautiful page comes up with lots of pretty plant pictures and says Garrett Park Arboretum. Click arrow below to view trees in town. And the arrow is at the bottom of the page, and it's white and it's tiny.
Yeah.
But you do that, pop it up, and you get this tiny little map, but you can scroll your mouse, roll and scroll your mouse, and expand it. And you can see the boundaries of town, and you'll see lots of dots, and each dot is a tree, and there's a number attached to it. And when you scroll your mouse and it gets big, the map gets bigger and bigger till you can actually see the numbers. Then if you click on a given number and tree, a dialog box opens, or information box
Hmm.
opens on the left side of the screen, and it will say tree located at, and there's the address, and it will give you the basic information as if it were a database on this given tree. So you're going to have the botanical or Latin name, common name, the size of the tree, which will be its diameter. There's even a link for a street view,
Mm.
which will give you like Google Map or something.
Yep.
If we know it, there will be a date planted. If we have the source, so you can see where it came from.
Phil, I'm looking at number 919. Just randomly picked that one.
All right.
And it's on Kenilworth. It's a flowering dogwood, 6-inch diameter, I assume. And that's the diameter of the trunk, not the entire tree
Yep.
canopy.
That's an industry standard.
Yeah. And then a seedling. It was a native seedling. And it says tree condition poor. And I noticed it was a red dot. So I'm assuming
Yeah.
that the color coding means something here.
The color coding is a size thing.
Okay.
So the red dots are dogwoods and other
Hmm.
flowering trees, and you may see a dark blue dot, and that's going to be a very big tree.
Yep. I see the
And
large
this is
ones.
what our contractor put in, and at first I wasn't using, but I have found it to be kind of handy. No, the condition is not going to be shown on the color.
Ah,
But you
okay.
say it's 919. What is the address?
It is 10925 Kenilworth. So kind of right on the left-hand side, halfway up near the intersection with Waverly, if listeners are following along. And what I was also going to ask with the tag ID number, so is there literally, as I've seen before in other gardens, a little metal round tag with this number on it?
Oh, there is.
So if you were to find and do it in reverse, you'll walk around, find the number, and
Hmm.
then correspond it back to the map and look up
Hmm.
the listing.
Yes, it's true.
Hmm.
We had a comprehensive arboretum plan developed by a contractor in 2019. They came up with the map, and it was also a management document. And they were using the current right-of-way maps, which are very strange in Garrett Park. They don't conform to any particular, because the way the town was laid out back in the day. And so
Hmm.
when they got done, we found we owned or had responsibility for a lot more trees than we ever planted, because the plantings only date back to 1978.
Hmm.
So this dogwood, for example, was probably planted by a resident, or it might have just come up there in someone's yard, but it was within the right of way. And so it was recorded by the contractor. And the good news about this is if a tree is on this map and it is found to be in the town right of way, it is a tree, the town's responsibility and actually mandate to care for this tree. And it also means that the homeowner should keep their hands off of them. And so it is considered a town tree. And we found we had a whole lot of dogwoods, never having actually planted any. These were all trees that were already on site or residents had put in.
Hmm. So, in wrapping up and looking
Yep.
at this map, it looks like I have a lot to explore, maybe with the day trip over to Garrett Park to check out things and enjoy the shade, maybe on a hot summer day.
Hmm.
Do you have a particular favorite or favorites amongst the town trees that you really gravitate to and visit every time you go?
Well, I have to say this. There's a tree in town. There's couple trees in town that are just really impressive. And they are not trees that the Arboretum Committee planted. Well, actually, one of them is. But there's a very large Nordmann fir on Kenilworth Avenue. I don't even know if it's shown on here. It might be. Oh, it'll take me a while to find it. But at any rate, this thing is probably close to 100 feet tall, and it probably dates. It's probably more than 100 years old, and apparently the town used to light it up every year. It's a rather rare tree, and you drive by it, and it's near a Victorian, and it just seems to fit.
Hmm.
It just seems to be the perfect thing for that. It might not even be a town tree, but it looks like that it is. And then at the end of one of the streets, there is a very big dawn redwood. Now, dawn redwoods are no longer uncommon in our area because it was adopted by nurseries very early on, but this tree looks like it's been there forever. It's over 100 feet tall and probably has a diameter of a couple of feet, maybe almost 30 inches. And it was only planted in 1980. And so I go to look at that tree because it's just like a miracle how big it got and how magnificent it got. It's a wonderful pointy tree with beautiful feathery foliage that comes off in the fall. It's an it's a conifer, but it is not an evergreen. So those are some of my favorites, and there's also some like botanical curiosities like the dove tree that I really like. And we have a number of ginkgos in town because we had a couple sites that were hot and dry. And so we have numerous ginkgo cultivars in town and a couple of blocks that are devoted to ginkgos. Hopefully the males only, but we've had a few sex changes on us, so it's been kind of interesting to see how that plays out.
Summing up, how can listeners find out more about the Garrett Park Arboretum or become involved? Or maybe if they want to do a small town arboretum, what would be their next steps?
It's hard to do. You have to have buy-in from the community. You have to have buy-in from your government. Most subdivisions are in Montgomery County, and Montgomery County does have a tree planting program, and they will plant trees for residents, but they're not probably very involved with getting organization started. However, you can find out more about the Garrett Park Arboretum just for learning more about it by going to the website. There's a lot of write ups about how it came to be. Looking at the maps, you can learn about the diversity of the trees that are there. And then there's also would be contact information with the town government. There is a town manager who is very on top of this. And can answer specific questions about how does the town buy trees and how did they go about sourcing technical help. How do we go about hiring tree companies? Because I actually work with not just planting and record keeping, but also I manage the annual tree work
Hmm.
that goes on in that town, which is considerable.
Yeah, I think this is a great example and case study for what can be done with street trees and tree canopy coverage in just a small area. And going back to the person who started it, Barbara, what one person can do to make a difference in their community.
Let me say one other thing. In my own neighborhood, which is in Montgomery County, Kensington, but not in Kensington proper, there was again another activist person who said, "I think we need more trees. The trees in this neighborhood are all aging out. The county's replacement rate is pretty poor.
Mm,
They have quite a few miles to cover, but they do have they will plant trees." And so this individual sort of sent out a survey to the listserv and proposed, planting trees and what kind of tree would you like? And some of the people who had no trees said, we don't want trees. And other people said, bring it on. And so she was able to coordinate with the county and get over 75 trees planted this spring. So that's a one-time thing, and it's not going to be an arboretum per se, but I do think that many of our down county streets and subdivisions are the trees are aging out.
mhm.
And so this might be a way of doing it. It may not be an arboretum, but it would be a way of fostering community tree planting.
And I think something that could be duplicated in neighborhoods across the region and
Hmm.
across the world, just one or two people taking it upon themselves to make sure that what trees we do lose get replaced.
Yes, indeed.
Any final thoughts on this small town arboretum project, Phil?
It's a pretty amazing thing to be associated with because I get to play with my arborist training, but also with my horticulturist training. And I get a lot of autonomy to figure out when there's an empty space, what might work there, knowing what else we have in town. And sometimes, like this last spring's planting cycle, it was almost all from residents coming to me and saying, we need a tree, we have a blank spot.
Hmm.
That doesn't always happen, but it's really good when it does. And just when you think the town is full, a space opens up or something like that. So we do what we can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Creeping raspberry plant profile. Creeping raspberry, Rubus hayata koizumi, is a low-growing raspberry relative that is a member of the rose family. The attractive leaves are held on cane-like stems that form a dense mat on the ground. It does well on slopes as an erosion control. Creeping raspberry is also known as Formosan carpet raspberry, crinkle leaf creeper, Taiwanese creeping rubus, and creeping bramble. It has white flowers in early summer that turn into edible fruits that are golden in color, similar in shape to blackberries or other raspberries. For best fruiting, planted in full sun. However, the leaves can be scorched in intense afternoon sun, so place it where it can get a bit of shade late in the day in hotter climates. The leaves turn a rust color in fall, and in most regions stay on over the winter. In some colder climates, it's semi-evergreen, but root hardy. One plant can spread 4 to 6 feet in diameter. It goes beyond its bounds, but prune it back at any time. Trim it out any time you see dead or broken cane stems. There are often soft thorns along the canes, and they are not usually a problem. Avoid stepping on it, though, due to those thorns and the stiff canes or stems that can break when trod upon. If you are in a cold climate, give it an extra mulch in late fall for winter protection. Fertilizer is not necessary, but a top dressing of organic compost in early spring can be beneficial and encourage fruit production as well. There's no need to rake up any fallen leaves in autumn, as they also add to the plant's nutrients. Take cuttings in the early summer to propagate it, or harvest seeds from the ripened fruits. Plant the seeds soon after harvesting. It's not generally troubled by pests. Birds may eat the fruits, but deer generally leave this tough plant alone. Overwatering may cause root rot in wet or heavy soil, so good drainage is a must. It is drought tolerant once established. Tip: sterilize your tools between pruning it and other rose family relatives so that you do not transmit diseases amongst them. A good garden hygiene practice is to wipe the pruner blades with an alcohol swab after each cut. Be careful to not cut yourself and wear leather gloves whenever you are pruning. Creeping raspberry, you can grow that. This profile was excerpted from the book Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm enjoying the blooms of my Spirea and astilbe. Over at the community garden plot, the radishes are bolting, as well as the spinach, cilantro, and broccoli. And we had a little incursion. A school bus crashed into the corner of our community garden and took out the pollinator gardening strip that we had been lovingly working on. It was in full bloom at the time, but we'll repair that and get that back to rights soon. The local happenings that you might be interested in include a Memorial Day weekend Art and Nature Festival at the National Botanic Garden near Chantilly, Virginia. You can find out more about that and purchase your tickets at nationalbotanicgarden.org. The Farmyard is partnering with the American Landscape Institute to offer its 5th annual plant sale fundraiser on Saturday, June 1st from 10 to 4. And the sale offers a variety of plants, tools, and other gardening items. Students and board members of the American Landscape Institute will also be available to answer your questions. And you can find out more about that at thefarmyard.llc.farm/plant-sale. And then the Washington Youth Garden at the U.S. National Arboretum is having a picnic party for the FONA Youth Garden Saturday, June 8th from 11 to 1. You can bring your picnic or purchase food from food trucks there. They want you to RSVP so they know how many people to expect, and that is at fona.org, FONA.org, for full details and to RSVP. And GardenDC has been nominated for a People's Choice Horty Award. That's HORTI, Horty Award. And I'd love to have your vote in that in the podcast category. And you can go to vote through June 15th at awards.gardencom.org/horty-awards-2024. And we'll try to include that link in the show notes as well. And in this week's garden tips, we're all about clematis. And we shared that clematis can climb up other plants, meaning trees and roses and other shrubs, but they can also be trained on a trellis, but that trellis must have no more width than that of a pencil for the little tendrils to grab onto. We also talked about how to prune the various clematis categories of 1, 2, and 3, and that clematis makes a great ground cover. So check out those garden tips on our social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter and follow us on Facebook. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Groundcover Revolution is here with you all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Groundcover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Groundcover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and bookshop.org. In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This is Christy Page with Green Prints with the last word on Stumpy's Farewell, A Cherry Blossom Tale, an article by our own Don Nicholas. As I strolled along the tidal basin in Washington, D.C., I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sadness mixed with excitement. The cherry blossoms, those delicate pink and white blooms that have enchanted visitors for over a century, were in full display. But looming over the celebration was the impending renovation project that would bid farewell to some of these iconic trees, including the beloved Stumpy. The story of these cherry trees dates back to 1912, when the mayor of Tokyo gifted 3,000 cherry trees to the city of Washington, D.C., as a symbol of friendship between Japan and the United States. Since then, the trees have flourished along the tidal basin, becoming a symbol of springtime and renewal. However, with rising water levels threatening their existence, it was time for a change. The renovation project aimed to rebuild and raise the seawalls around the basin, ensuring a healthier environment for the remaining trees and the addition of new ones. Among the casualties of this necessary transformation was Stumpy, a scraggly little cherry tree with a trunk mostly rotted out. Despite its less than perfect appearance, Stumpy had captured the hearts of many visitors over the years. In fact, Stumpy even had its own calendar showcasing its transformation through the seasons. As I walked among the cherry blossoms, I couldn't help but notice the outpouring of affection for Stumpy. Visitors snapped photos and shared stories of past encounters with the charmingly imperfect tree. It was a bittersweet farewell, but one filled with gratitude for the memories Stumpy had provided. But amidst the sadness, there was also hope. The renovation project promised not only to preserve the legacy of the cherry trees, but to enhance it. With new trees planned for planting and improved infrastructure to protect them, the future looked bright for this cherished symbol of friendship and beauty. As I bid farewell to Stumpy and the other trees slated for removal, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the opportunity to witness this moment in history. Change was inevitable, but the spirit of the cherry blossoms would endure, bringing joy and inspiration to generations to come. And so, with a mixture of sadness and anticipation, I said my final goodbye to Stumpy, knowing that its legacy would live forever in the hearts of all who had the privilege of knowing it. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the tidal basin, where the cherry blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, a reminder that even in the face of change, beauty would always find a way to bloom anew. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm patreon.com/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.blogspot.com. Thank you. You can find and follow Washington Gardener on Twitter/X, Instagram, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. Please take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Spotify and Apple. Open the Spotify or Apple app, search for Garden DC, check on the rate button, and select 5 stars.